Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to our YouTube channel. And we have the lovely Michelle Gray, whose information will be on the splash screen, but also in the description box, in case you don't catch that one. We are going to channel my son, Eric, and people are like, who's Eric? He is my son who is now in the afterlife, who has an amazing perspective as a spirit, not a human being, on different topics. And he's also able to bring in a lot of notable figures where a lot of times, mediums can't do that on their own without a little help from our little friend Eric. Hi, Eric. I love you.
Hi, Mom. I love you so much. He says, hi, everybody.
And we're going to talk about the woke movement. So
Mm.
this is something that has been bothering me for a while. But let's talk about the woke movement first. Paula has been so wonderful in gathering questions from the community, but she always puts a little bit of background, which I think is amazing. The term was originally coined by progressive Black Americans and used in racial justice movements in the early to mid 1900s.
Mm.
To be woke politically in the Black community means that someone is informed, educated, and conscious of social injustice and racial inequality. Beginning in the 2010s, it came to encompass a broader awareness of social inequities or inequalities, such as racial injustice, sexism, and the denial of LGBT rights. Yes, nobody likes inequality, obviously. So
Hmm.
here are the questions from the community. I love you, community. You guys are so brilliant. When I was a kid in the 80s, oh, wait. Yeah, I'm recording good. Ooh, almost, heart almost dropped there, but yes. Okay. When I was a kid in the 80s, being woke was a positive thing. At what point did that change, Eric? And why has the MAGA movement done everything possible to discourage the fairness and visibility that once were cornerstones in being woke?
So Eric says that being woke, it stems from, he says, the foundational energy is oppression.
Yes.
So he says, if you think about everything that we've experienced as a society for a very, very, very long time, are these different spouts of oppression in different areas. And he says, so now let's not confuse woke with awakening. But if we look at the movement, and he says generational changes, he says the generation that is in, he says, between the 20s, even a little bit younger, so 18, he says, to 40, there's a generation in there that is a different energy and is here to make a shift. So he says, why is there an increase in attention? Because the oppression can no longer, he says, think of the changes in the world, the awakening process itself. He says it can no longer stay. And so it's shifted to something much bigger. But he says the this is still part of the teaching and learning,
Yeah.
even though he says we all know that there are pieces to it that are uncomfortable. But he says this does stem from oppression. And so there is truth in this,
Oh, yeah.
because this is, he says, as a society, we are surrendering. We're being asked to surrender. So he says this movement has started to squeeze. It's giving a lot of squeezing to our collective. And he says, and as we say this, how does this make everyone feel? How do you feel squeezed by this subject matter?
Well, all of these lists that these groups, they have been oppressed.
Yes.
That's causing the racial injustice, the LGBT rights denial, anti-women, ageist even. So yeah, it's a
Yes.
problem. All right. So next question: Is the woke movement meant to prepare all of us for the next level of enlightenment and to help us transition into 4D from 3D? Those are dimensions.
Yes. And he says, well, yes, of course, because anything that creates a change, anything that promotes thinking, anything that allows somebody to look at injustice, he says that gives the opportunity for one to go deeper within themselves. So yes, this is all part of the process.
Okay. Is the cancel culture part of the woke movement, like canceling past events of history to align with the mindset of today? I don't know that we should cancel past events. We should keep them there in our minds and our hearts to learn from them. Whether they're negative, well, there's no negative experience. These are all just lessons from the past too. But anyway, let's get the wise ones viewpoint on that. Erik?
He says, well, he goes, Mom, he says, canceling is a judgment. Canceling is saying, we're going to take this, but we're not going to take this. That's not the way history is. That's not the way we learn. We don't learn from picking and choosing what we're going to keep, what we're going to cancel, what we're going to admit, because even the things that we've experienced that we perceive as negative, as we know, he says, is a very important part of the learning process. We learn from our mistakes.
Yeah, I agree. And this toppling of like George Washington statues or defacing paintings of him and others just because he was a slave owner, I think that's wrong. Yes, that was not good. But the first slave owner was actually a black man. But that's something we can learn from. That horrible part of our history, we should never forget, ever forget. So that's just me saying that, although obviously I'm against slavery. Unless it's my children. Go do the wash. I'm kidding. What is the agenda of the woke movement? The ultimate agenda?
Well, he says this is a bit of a tricky one because we have to remember that although actually the woke movement is about education, it is about understanding, it's looking back and saying, where were we and where are we now? What is acceptable today? Where is the humanity in today?
Yeah.
And he says, but the agenda, is there an agenda to this? Yeah, there is. He says, he goes, well, let's look at marketing schemes. He says, do you know how many companies are using the woke movement as a way to push a product or push to get a hold of a certain demographic?
Yeah.
And he says, and for our knowledge to understand that many of the CEOs or the investors to a lot of these big companies are not aligned with any of that at all. So he says there's a lot of gaslighting that's happening with a lot of this. So he says there's a core truth to it. And that's why there's so much passion for many people, why they're right, because they know, they can feel it. They know the injustice, they feel it. But he says there's also many different areas in our society that are taking advantage of that as well.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people have co-opted the truth behind the woke movement, the core of it that has value to try to make money off of it. Like that
Yes.
sometimes backfire. Look what happened to Budweiser.
Yes.
Look what happened to Target with the tuck friendly clothing. I mean, I think some of it just goes past where it should, frankly. And then what happens is there's so much uproar and division about it that the minds are off of the truth behind it, the oppression and what needs to be done about it. So
he says that's right, Mom, because what it creates, and there's my throat chakra there, it starts to suppress the voices. It
yeah,
starts to suppress the truth of what really needs to be looked at, and it ends up becoming a I stand on this side, you stand on that side, I'm right, you're wrong. And that, he says, it's just like being in a schoolyard and yelling and screaming at each other. It
yeah,
doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't solve anything.
that's right. How can it mutate to serve the highest good for all? I mean, yes, we've got the beautiful core that needs to be nurtured and fostered and paid attention to, but you have all these other offshoots that it's created, my throat too, that has deflated it, that has brandished it negatively in some people's minds. So how can it mutate so that it does serve the highest and greatest good of the collective?
Well, he says the evolution of consciousness. And he says we have to remember there's a lot of factors to the evolution of our consciousness. Um, each and
Mm,
every individual, as well as the support that we get around our evolution from spiritual beings, from higher dimensional beings that are very interested
yeah.
in our movement and in our growth. So he says in the evolution, we have to look at what we understand today, and he says we are moving into a place, and he says yeah, it's taken some time, and it's going to take some time, because he says we're moving to a place where we can start to move leaders into a position that are not interested in the financial part of it, or the
Yeah.
gain, or the greed.
Mm.
And that's what we're really looking for, is having those that can help guide us as a collective, and not necessarily those that are interested for their own gain or the gain of a certain upper society.
I think the part of the woke movement that I like the least is the fact that people are so offended and so sensitive about the silliest things. Hey, you know what? I just should tell them, hey, you try losing a son, I'll tell you what's important and offensive, okay? But seriously, any little mispronoun thing or whatever, I mean, it just gets everybody in, so you have this snowflake culture, this infantilized adults who have to have rooms on the campus so that they can play with Play-Doh to help whatever. Am I being too insensitive, Eric? But I mean,
Well,
it
he says,
seems like it's to create more division and offense.
and he says, Mom, he goes, so let's talk about that for a second, because this is important to understand. He says that you're right, it creates division, and there is a lot of division. He says a division in, he's saying boomers, like being called boomers, and being of a certain society. You are toxic, you are tragic. He's saying all of these things from one side to the other.
Yeah.
And then he says, and then the opposite is you're too soft, you're too this, you're too sensitive. And he goes, is there a middle ground to this? Well, there is. And here's the thing, we have to understand. And he goes, and Mom, you know this so well. Going through something tragic and going through pain is what often brings us to a point of understanding deeper, a point of being able to move forward. Because many times, especially with you, Mom, he says you had no choice.
Yeah.
You had no choice. It was exactly what it was, and you had to move forward. So he says, when it comes to healing, when it comes to true healing, what is it that allows each individual to really dig down deep, to be able to heal, to be able to release generational trauma, to be able to release the pain that maybe they experienced in their childhood? And he says, this isn't saying that anyone does not hold pain or did not have a difficult childhood. What this is saying is, what triggers you? Are you being triggered? We have to allow people to feel triggered. Now,
Yeah.
at the same time, he says there is also on the other side people that just don't accept. So people that are just not accepting to there being another way.
Mm.
And so on both sides, how about some acceptance? But here's some advice. If you feel triggered, if somebody is mislabeling you, if somebody is what you feel is taking something away from you. He says, if your first inclination is to defend and fight back and put somebody in your place, he says, take yourself out of what the subject matter is and go down deeply to say, what is it in my life, or what does this remind me of why I feel so triggered by this? Because he
Yeah.
says the triggers are there to help us heal. And that's part of what the deep healing really is.
So that's good. Um, but instead of canceling or going in a room and playing with Play-Doh, I mean, I think each generation needs to find their voice, set their boundaries, find their power again, instead of always being the oppressed versus the victim. Why can't we meld together and be a thriver and an oppressor that has learned the evil of their ways, or you know what I mean? I mean, there's got
Yes.
to be a healthier approach than to
He
take
says
distant
he says
corners.
yes. He says yes, and he's showing sitting at the table. And he says, rather than sitting at opposite ends of the table, can we sit side by side?
Yeah.
Can we sit beside each other? Can we allow each other to have our beliefs? And can we speak without hurting each other? He goes, if you have a conversation and you're able to have a conversation with someone, you might learn something.
Yeah.
You might learn from a perspective. So he says that's exactly what this is it's no longer going to be, and he says more and more as we go forward, acceptable to hold division. He
Yeah.
says fifth dimensional energy is oneness and being able to come together, not to be the same, not to think the same, but to be connected in acceptance, to be able to see I am you and you are me, and to be able to embody that here on earth.
So how can we help? Because when people are shrinking violets and oh poor me and or very sensitive, which I honor, then there's still that you still have this oppressor victim thing going on. And how do we heal that and help these people with their sensitivity? Which is, obviously it's there for a reason,
Mm-hmm.
I'm
And
not
he said,
trivializing it at all.
and this is what is working itself out. And
Good.
he says, and the younger generation, so he's showing me ages 16 and younger. The younger generation is coming up with even another platform. And he said, this is the platform of children that have an openness. And this is neutralization. So he
Oh,
says that this generation is coming in to neutralize a lot of this energy so that we can start to see each other on equal playing field so that there can be more peace, because he says the goal is conversation,
yeah.
not this. He goes, think
Right.
of everything that we've been taught is to be able to have arms and go against each other and to fight. And he says that's not just going to go away like that. He goes, even though many of us are already in that space where we don't believe that way, and we are existing in a way that is, he says, love thy neighbor.
Yeah.
But he says he's saying how consciousness is and how every new generation comes in is to help diffuse the generation before and to help heal. And that is
Yeah.
what's happening. But we have to
Good.
remember as individuals, he says, what are you doing as an individual? He goes, that's where it has to start. How do you handle these things individually? Because that is what will keep rolling out into the collective.
Good. So I think we might have already answered much of this, but here's the next question. Why are they, whoever that is, defensive toward others when you don't agree with them? So now it's like you can't have the difference of opinion and without being attacked. But isn't that how we grow? I've learned from other people's opinions that I disagreed with at first, but then changed my mind.
He says, because he says, if you are identifying with something and he says it does not matter, let's say, whether that is the actual truth within you or you believe that is the truth. If somebody else is looking at you and saying, I know that's not really true about you, and this is what I think, he says, if that person has a place in them that it needs to be looked at, he
Mm,
says, when you have had healing, when you have healed wounds within you, when something comes towards you, he says, you understand that it's not about you, it's about the other person. So defensiveness comes from defending my story, what I'm attached to, what I believe
yeah.
in.
Yeah.
So he says that's something that is very common that we see when somebody yells out a name or says, this isn't true. Somebody wants to defend that belief because that belief may be attached to many other things as well.
Oh, yeah. Makes sense. Oh, why have they, I don't know who that is, taken over women's sports? I mean, this is something that I don't think should happen. I mean, I'm a doctor. I know that biological males have bigger respiratory capacity, bigger muscles, etc. Even if they're not on, even if they're on testosterone blocking agents, etc. It doesn't make any difference. And so you had that one poor girl who had a concussion because the guy slammed the volleyball into her head. I just don't think that biological males ought to be competing with biological females. So what's going to happen there? Or
He
what do you
says
think
that,
about that, Eric? What's your opinion? I mean, I just think it's dangerous. I'm not dishonoring trans males at all. Okay, that's fine, but it has to be a level playing field, really, just to be safe. I'm talking
well,
about the mom and the doctor and me.
yes, and he says possibly there is an option that can be made to help. Um, he's saying like weight class and size, like being able to compare where
Oh,
somebody is at in,
yeah,
like he's showing like a fighting ring, like wrestling, like who's your opponent, what's the weight, like
yeah,
what's the
yeah.
class. He says, so there's different ways that we can navigate through this, but he
That's
goes,
a
the
good idea.
unfortunate part, Mom, the unfortunate part is he says there's going to be a lot of incidents and things that are going to happen to
Yeah.
help get to that point.
Oh, okay. Well, what
He's
about the biological males who are trans just competing with each other
Yes.
and
And he
females?
says, yes. And he says, so these are the conversations that need to be had. These are the things that need to be brought to the table. Now, he says that there's also, and I'm not quite sure how he means it, but he says there's financial gain in a lot of this, having
Yeah.
people butting heads with this right
Hmm.
now, too.
Okay. Um, so what percentage of males, biological males, are just pretending to be trans in order to be higher ranked in like volleyball or swimming, etc.? Does that exist?
He actually says it's a very low percentage.
I felt like it probably is very
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Is this woke movement about the downfall of the USA? Many similarities with ancient Rome are happening here, this person says.
Um, he says, well, it depends on your perception of how you want to look at it, because he says if you want to think that it's the downfall of the USA, well, it could be perceived that way, but he goes, really, it's the pulling apart so that rebuilding can take place.
Yeah, maybe parts of the USA needs to have a downfall,
Mm-hmm.
like you
Mm-hmm.
say, and then
Mm-hmm.
come up with a new. And it's like broken bones. When it heals, the fracture site is stronger than the original bone. So
Yes.
maybe
Yes.
something like that is happening.
He says exactly.
All right, next is the purpose of woke to assist with our spiritual growth and to be less judgmental and more accepting of others. I would say that is, but we need to get the kinks out, these harmful components and this greed and money and corruption that's kind of inextricably part of it that needs to be untangled. But okay, I'll shut
Yeah.
up.
He says, yeah, Mom. He goes, yeah, you have it exactly right. He says, of course, it's about acceptance. It's about understanding, compassion, all of those things. He says it's about releasing the division and seeing where we can come together. And so that is, of course, part of the direction that we're heading, which is oneness.
Okay. Would the woke movement have happened without devices like iPhones, etc., which feels like an ET gift, this person says.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. He says yes, yes, because that's the direction of consciousness. However, he says the ability to be able to communicate so easily and so quickly. He says the
Yeah.
ability that anyone can broadcast around the world at any time. That's inflated.
Yeah.
It's inflated it. So he says it still would happen, but it's the communication, and that's part of the reason why it's also so present
Yeah.
as well.
Well, people who are coming out as a different gender or whatever, it's easier to do when you're doing it on TikTok or whatever, so it feels less vulnerable. But back in the days before the computer and all that stuff, it's hard to
Yes,
let yourself be seen as who you
yes,
feel like you truly are. So
yes,
that's probably a part of it, right?
yes. And he says because there's a way to be able to come together in communities and be able to have understanding with complete strangers
Yeah.
around the world.
Yeah. People need to be heard and
Yes.
seen.
Yes.
That's what we all want for each other.
Yes.
What percentage are woke in the world, and what percentage will be woke in the next 5 years?
Well, he says it's kind of difficult because what he's saying is we can put it together as general because there's so many different variations of woke. But
Okay.
in our discussion today, he says it's less than half.
Okay.
It's closer to the 40% mark.
Okay. And in 5 years, more, I guess. If we can get the bad seeds out of it.
He says more, and what he's showing is there being more of a rather than saying woke, he says awakening because
I like
it's
that.
expanding.
Proper grammar too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we need to be awakened to other people's truths, basically,
Yes.
without hurting each other along the way.
Yes.
I think that's
He says part of what we're talking about today is filled with a lot of assumption and a lot of blame and pain.
yeah. Yeah. Will religion be gone? And we'll make this our last one before we go pause and go to part 2. Will religion be gone in the next 10 years?
He says no.
Okay.
Changing.
It'll change. Yeah.
Changing, but not gone.
I'm hoping that religion needs to, religion is about a religion spreading their truth, but it's sometimes at the expense of honoring the truth of the individual. So that hopefully will be a change in religion over time.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, guys. Be sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell. And yeah, that's thank you, Michelle Gray. Check her out in the description box, people. Bye.